Good evening. It's day 6 of the Israel-Hamas war. More than 2,000 different locations have been hit by air in Gaza. Now, Israel is also preparing for a massive ground operation. While the objective of this operation, this counteroffensive from Israel, is very clear. That is to militarily annihilate Hamas, to ensure that Hamas does not ever dare to attack another Israeli civilian or citizen. But what happens after that? What happens after Hamas is cut off its knees? What happens after that is unclear, because there will be a political vacuum. What replaces that political vacuum? Israeli leaders from Benjamin Netanyahu downwards have also been consistently saying that Hamas is worse than ISIS. Today, the Israeli Defense Forces put out a video showing footage of Hamas fighters who attacked Israeli citizens on Saturday carrying ISIS flags. Now, why should the world put up with such a nebulous terrorist organization? A terrorist ideology, a violent ideology, which basically wants to take the world back to the 7th century, calls for the destruction of all non-Muslims and the establishment of a caliphate. And the counter question to Israel is, yes, you can cut Hamas off its knees, you can militarily ensure that they are annihilated, but what about the political ideology that has spawned them? What is the idea that replaces that? Because you cannot kill an idea with military action. You can only kill an idea with another one. Both those questions we'll put to our guests, but first, the story so far.
के रास्ते से है, बॉर्डर के एरिया से है, पूरी सड़क पे तांडव मचा दिया था हमास के लड़ाकों ने.
You can hear military helicopters buzzing overhead. There is intermittent sound of bombs and rockets going off. And this is where one of the rockets fell. This is what remains of a car.
The terrorists got the clinic was attacked for hours, but this is the time, the second that the terrorists came inside and started butchering people. They shot her between the legs. She's telling us that, and she's telling me they are on top of me.
He kept telling that during the whole time the terrorist was laughing.
They were laughing. They were
and making jokes between them.
So in this moment, you must be crystal clear. We stand with Israel.
You may be strong enough on your own to defend yourself, but as long as America exists, you will never ever have to. We will always be there by your side.
I was here predominantly to show solidarity to the Israeli people, to provide support to the Israeli government.
Now, here's why this ISIS-Hamas nexus, alleged by the Israeli Defense Forces and the Israeli government, why is this important? Because this is no longer then just a problem between Israel and Hamas or Israel and the Palestinians. This is about an anti-Israel agenda which ISIS holds. It calls for the destruction of Israel as a central ideological goal. ISIS propaganda is motivated by the cause to liberate Palestine. Now, liberation of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is in Jerusalem, which is of course disputed between the Jews and the Muslims, that is also one of the key objectives of ISIS. ISIS propaganda focuses on a Jewish-Christian plot against Islam. This is no longer about two sets of people and their rights to self-government or land. This is about a civilizational clash, as has been outlined by the ISIS ideology. ISIS calls on all Muslims, wherever you are. You can be in a far-flung corner of the world. You could be in Australia or Indonesia, but it calls on all Muslims to attack Jewish communities around the world. In fact, the Sinai branch of ISIS promotes itself as the conqueror of Jerusalem. Active ISIS radicalization operations have been unearthed in Israel. Over 80 ISIS-linked prisoners are currently in Israeli jails. Now, one of the fundamental demands of the terrorists who carried out those attacks on Saturday was the release of prisoners. We don't know how many of them are fighting for the Palestinian cause and how many of them have diffused into ISIS, which is essentially this absolutely nebulous, violent 7th century ideology, which, like I said, calls for the extermination of all Israeli Jews. Now, Benjamin Netanyahu had tweeted, and in fact, the very first speech that he made after the attacks, he said, Hamas is worse than ISIS. Let's recap how Israel too, and today the Israeli Defense Forces put out that video from Saturday, which showed Hamas fighters carrying the ISIS flags. Let's put out a bunch of sound bites from Israeli leaders as to how they have framed this fight. This is not just a fight for a political question or the lack of addressing a political question. This is a fight against a violent nihilist ideology. That's the framing.
Israel is at war. We didn't want this war. It was forced upon us in the most brutal and savage way. The savage attacks that Hamas perpetrated against innocent Israelis are mind-boggling, kidnapping scores of women, children, and elderly, even Holocaust survivors. But though Israel didn't start this war, Israel will finish it. Joe, I want to give you a clear picture of the difficult situation we face. We were struck Saturday by an attack whose savagery I can say we have not seen since the Holocaust. I mean, we had hundreds massacred, families wiped out in their beds in their homes, women brutally raped and murdered. We've never seen such savagery in the history of the state. And they're even worse than ISIS. They're even worse than ISIS, and we need to treat them as such.
They're even worse than ISIS, and we need to treat them as such. Now, meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in Israel. He's on a mission to assure all possible American support to the Israeli government, as well as to prevent a larger war from erupting in the wider Middle East. The U.S. has deployed military support to Israel, including rebooting the Iron Dome, as well as artillery support. The U.S. has also mobilized its biggest aircraft carrier, in fact, the biggest in the world, the USS Gerald Ford, to provide military support and also to send out a warning to Iran, do not get involved. Meanwhile, UK Foreign Secretary James Cleverly is also in Israel to reiterate Israel's right to defend itself and Britain's support to Israel in doing that.
So in this moment, we must be crystal clear. We stand with Israel.
You may be strong enough on your own to defend yourself, but as long as America exists, you will never ever have to. We will always be there by your side.
I was here predominantly to show solidarity to the Israeli people, to provide support to the Israeli government.
All right, let me open this up to our guests who are joining us, a full panel joining us this evening on Brass Tacks. Professor Max Abrams is a global security expert, is the author of books on terrorist dynamics. Charlotte Littlewood is the former head of the UK-India desk at ICFS. She's joining us from London. Michael Dixon is a British-Israeli writer, joining us from Ra'anana in Israel. D.P. Srivastava is former Indian ambassador to the Islamic Republic of Iran and a distinguished fellow at the Vivekananda International Foundation. And Herb Keenan is an Israeli columnist who's joining us. Let me start with Mr. Dixon because, extraordinary events on Saturday and then the Israeli response to it. We're 6 days out since that began. Please help our viewers understand, yes, Israel's military objective is to go into Gaza. They've called in something like 300,000 reservists. There's going to be a massive ground operation to basically cut Hamas off its knees. How easy or difficult and how long will this operation last? And what may be the collateral damage as a result of that?
Well, of course, we have the possibility of a long and protracted campaign. And as you said in your introduction, and you showed the pictures, this has been called Israel's 9/11, and the result of it must be the downfall of Hamas. So the IDF and Israel has demonstrated that because Hamas have declared war on Israel, they will spare no effort in making sure they absolutely dismantle these terrorists. And they must do that because we will never allow an attack like this to happen again. And not just that, Hamas's dismantlement is important for the entire world, because other terrorist organizations are looking at this now and thinking, can they get away with it? Israel's commitment is firm. They will not get away with this, and they will send a message to anybody who would massacre innocents, who would take babies from their cribs and behead them, who would rape women and pillage villages and towns, and then take children as their kidnappees in Gaza. We will not allow that, and that's why this campaign must take as long as it takes for the utter dismantlement of Hamas.
If Max Abrams is there, Max Abrams, the discovery that these Hamas, all right, let me put that to Charlotte Littlewood. The discovery that these Hamas terrorists were carrying ISIS flags, that makes it a battle between the civilized world and everything that the civilized world stands for, and this 7th century violent, nihilistic ideology. It's not just a problem between two sets of peoples and their rights to land or rights to self-government or the history therein. This is about the civilized world's answer to a group of people who believe in taking all of us back to the 7th century.
There are quite a few different things happening here at once. And so in part, absolutely what you're saying is correct. But also there is an ongoing issue around the Palestine-Israel conflict. But what you're saying here is absolutely correct. And that's something that Hamas has always believed in and has always advocated. In 2019, the statements were for people to kill Jews essentially where they find them, find Jews and kill them. That's always been the thinking of Hamas. And there's a very problematic hadith that's been interpreted in a very extreme way about the end days, in which Jews will hide behind rocks and trees and rocks will turn around and say to the Muslims, here is the Jew, kill him. And this has been used as a bedrock for a lot of extreme Islamist groups. Iran sees the eradication of Jews from the world as the beginning of the end days, and there have been comments from some in the regime who have said it's useful that they're all in Israel. So this is not a surprise that there's an ISIS flag, and in fact it's all the same ideology. But that doesn't mean to say there isn't also an issue of Palestinians living in awful conditions, and I think that there needs to be changes there too, and there needs to be a way in which we can move forward from that. But that is almost separate to what we see with this terrorist ideology.
All right, let me go to DP Srivastav and ask him this as well, because like I said, the fact that ISIS flags were found there, and I want to underline this is what the IDF is claiming, this is what Netanyahu is claiming. Independent verification, whether it is for CNN News18 or any other independent media outlet, we are not in a position to independently verify this. So I'm going to add that caveat. But going by what has been said by the IDF and what has been said by Mr. Netanyahu, that ISIS flags were discovered, then it's not just an Israel-Palestine problem. This is a civilized world versus uncivilized barbarians problem. And yes, one part of that problem is, to violently respond to them, because I guess they only understand the language of violence. But more importantly, beyond that, it is also a problem of ideology and ideas. And I said this at the top of the show, you cannot kill an idea with just military force. An idea has to be killed with a better idea. DP Srivastav.
Thank you for having me. I cannot comment on something which, as you mentioned, has not yet been proven. There are some indications that ISIS flags have been found. But let me begin by saying that this act of terrorism has to be condemned very strongly. Our Prime Minister has already done so. There cannot be any justification for terrorist violence against unarmed combatants, women and children. Second, I might add that in order to ensure that this conflict does not escalate further, first thing should be unconditional release of the women and children or other civilians who have been taken hostage by Hamas. And this step is important so that to ensure that this conflict does not spread. I may also add that, as you mentioned earlier, that there are competing ideas, and I think if the world has to show that there's a way forward, we have to show that there are other ideas on the table for a political solution of this problem, and that includes two-state solution. But that will have to wait. The first step, as I mentioned, should be unconditional release of women and children who have been taken hostage by Hamas.
Okay, let me go across to the wall there. Let me ask Herb Keenan this. He's joining us from Israel. He's also a columnist with the Jerusalem Post. Yes, like I said, everybody knows what the immediate military objective is, Mr. Keenan. But more importantly, all right, Israel goes in, it cuts Hamas off its knees. Hamas is never in a position to attack Israeli citizens ever again. But what about the political vacuum that will be left behind? What about the political ideology that has spawned Hamas in the first place? How is Israel going to counter that?
Look, the political ideology that spawned Hamas is kind of a simple one, and that is that Israel doesn't have a right to exist. Hamas didn't attack because there's a political vacuum. Hamas attacked because Israel is here, and they don't want Israel to be here. And I think that's clear from what we saw on Saturday. Right? You don't behead babies and rape and murder women because you've got a political problem. You do that because that's part of a genocidal ideology. And I think what's happened in Israel is that has been internalized now by the population. And the Israeli population, who's going to live here and wants to live here, is not going to tolerate a situation where you have those folks right on your border. So I think to say that, this is some kind of political problem, and that if Israel would have just done X, Y, or Z, it wouldn't have happened, I think that's very much wishful thinking.
But can I ask you, and one of the reasons I'm asking you this is because today, I'm sure you've seen this, the IDF has claimed that they have footage and they've seen footage, they've released some of it as well, of Hamas terrorists who attacked Israel on Saturday with ISIS flags. And we were led to believe that ISIS was finished, that by 2020, 2021, ISIS was over in Syria and in Iraq. At least militarily, at least in a position where they could launch violent attacks, it had been annihilated. That body had been annihilated with the death of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. But if this is indeed true, that Hamas fighters were waving ISIS flags and they believe in ISIS ideology, then ISIS still has relevance in the Middle East, and it's a concern of the entire civilized world to respond to that by military means and through also political means, because I keep saying this, you cannot counter an ideology just with guns and aircraft carriers and strikes. You need to counter it with a counter ideology, a better idea, which more people will believe in, and not an ideology that violently wants to take us back to the 7th century.
Look, I think what's worrying for us is what we saw on Saturday. And it doesn't matter if it's Hamas or it's ISIS, the ideology is not that different, right? What matters for us is how you can prevent that from happening again. And I think what happened on Saturday is that Israel had a failure of imagination, meaning that Israel could not imagine that an army of terrorists would pour across the border and start slaughtering civilians. And now it's had a wake-up call, and that's that, well, this could happen. So all the energy right now is going to be in trying to ensure that something like that can never happen again, not in the South or in the North, right? The branding of the organization, or do they belong to this murderer or that murderer, that's secondary.
Okay.
Right? The thing is, how do you eradicate this from your border? So that's the focus right now.
Let me ask Max Abrams, again, I want to take this story forward because a lot is contingent. What's going to happen in the next few weeks in Gaza and Israel's counteroffensive is contingent on whether this can be contained to an operation within that area between Israel and Hamas, or will this spread to wider areas? Last night there was this whole scare that Hezbollah fighters had launched some kind of strikes from the northern side of Israel, from southern Lebanon. There is chatter that Iran could possibly be involved. Neither the Americans nor the Israelis are giving concrete evidence of the involvement of Iran, but there have been multiple conversations. The Iranian leader has spoken to the Saudi Crown Prince. I believe the Iranian foreign minister is going to be in Lebanon, perhaps to send out a message to Hezbollah. But what is the chance that this can be contained as just a limited war, if you will, between Israel and Hamas without it spilling over into the wider Middle East? Because that, of course, would have far greater ramifications than if this operation were to be contained in that limited geography.
Sure. My best bet is that this war will not be contained to Gaza. Israel really had two choices. In the face of the worst terrorist attack against Israel in its entire, livelihood, and one of the worst terrorist attacks in terms of fatalities ever recorded anywhere around the world, Israel could have been very restrained and essentially done nothing, which would have invited more terrorism, or it could take the fight to Hamas in Gaza, which it is doing now. The problem, as everybody knows, is that there are 2.2 million Gazans, and that Hamas intentionally buries itself in the population in order to maximize Palestinian civilian deaths. Hamas literally places its headquarters underneath a major hospital in Gaza. And so Israel inevitably is going to be causing a large amount of civilian pain in Gaza. And Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, is going to use that as a pretext, most likely. I'm just predicting. A lot of people would predict the same thing here, that Nasrallah will open up a second front. We know that there is a very tight relationship, an ongoing daily relationship between Iran and Hezbollah. And this is why Israel is so, on alarm about the salvos coming from the north, because that would be consistent with the way that Nasrallah thinks and has acted historically. I also wouldn't be surprised at all if there's growing discord and political violence and terrorism out of the West Bank. Understandably, we're talking a lot about Gaza because that's where Hamas is based, but Hamas also has a lot of supporters in the West Bank. Furthermore, these groups, whether we're talking about Palestinian Islamic Jihad or the Lion's Den, out of the West Bank, they are interconnected. All of this, of course, could be commingled with some type of an internal intifada of Arab Israelis, not all of them, but a portion of them rising up and also using violence.
Okay.
Iran, so there are many possibilities about how this conflict could spread, and I haven't even exhausted them.
So let me go to Mr. Dixon. Some of these could become a reality. Some of these could be deterred. One of the actions that the U.S. has taken is to move its biggest aircraft strike carrier group, the Gerald Ford. And I think Biden said this in his press conference yesterday. If Iran or any other player in that region wants to take advantage of what's going on, then do not. Would that message resonate in Tehran, or do you see this spilling into a wider conflict? Because if it does, then what is Israel going to do? If it's going to be attacked from the south, an attack from the north, an attack from its east, what does Israel do?
Well, let's be clear. Israel has never lost a war, and it doesn't intend to lose this war. And there's a reason why. Israel loses a war, and there's no more Israel. So Israel is always fighting for its survival. And Israel is taking precautions. It is evacuating some civilians from its northern border. It is making sure to enhance and enforce forces that are on the different borders. But Israel has faced multi-pronged attacks in the past. This is the kind of thing that they do expect. So there is not a failure of imagination in this regard, because Israel does war drills constantly. Israel knows that should its enemies put down their weapons, there would be peace the next day. But if Israel would put down its weapons, there would be no more Israel. So we're always fighting for our survival here in Israel, and it's a battle that we intend to win. Obviously, the strongest possible terms have come from the United States and hopefully other countries as well, to warn other players in the Middle East to stay out of this conflict, and they should do so. But if they decided to come onto the battlefield, Israel is ready, and America has shown they're going to stand foursquare behind them in the fight.
But the point that I think Max Abrams was alluding to, maybe it's not a question that Israel is concerned about, or maybe this question isn't even being asked right now. But surely it'll happen 3 months or 6 months, whenever this ground operation concludes. What takes Hamas's place? I mean, what's the vacuum, and how are you going to fill that vacuum? Because Hamas itself came into existence because of the vacuum that was created after Israel's withdrawal in 2005. And whatever agreements that were there between Fatah and Israel, that didn't come to bear. They were not fully implemented. There was a vacuum, and Hamas, exploited that vacuum, and they came in. So what takes Hamas's place?
You're absolutely right that Hamas...
Mr. Dixon, yeah, thank you. Yeah.
And was democratically elected, but then in a violent coup overthrew their Fatah brothers in a very violent way and took power, and have since held Gaza under their jackboot. But the truth is that the question of what happens after Hamas is not Israel's concern, because Israel cannot live with Hamas in charge of Gaza. So Israel's calculation here is that anything is better than this ISIS-like organization that is willing to, and has the means to, by funding from Iran, slaughter Israeli innocents and Israeli families. So Israel has decided, it's made a strategic decision. If in the past there were more limited attempts to break Hamas's capacity, this time it's all or nothing. It's goodbye to Hamas, and whatever comes next cannot be worse than what we've just seen on the worst carnage that's happened to the Jewish people since the Holocaust.
So, Charlotte Littlewood, so far the biggest support, of course, has come from the United States. They're moving military assets there. They're sending out a signal to other Arab countries, do not get involved. But how much of what happened on Saturday and the response thereof is also because of, the political dysfunction that we've seen over the better part of the last decade or so, in fact, maybe even more. There has been really no attempt at any kind of negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians, even with Fatah. I don't think there's been any conversation at all. From time to time, particularly Mr. Netanyahu, because of his own political problems, he was stuck in this whole quagmire. There is a feeling that maybe part of that intelligence failure was because institutions were divided, and the politics was so bitterly polarizing that people in charge of security kind of overlooked. There was oversight over what happened. Do you see this war sort of bringing the country together and the institutions together in a way that Israel finds its political bearings once again?
I mean, momentarily, the country's being brought together as this is, as we've just heard, the biggest attack on the Jewish community since the Holocaust, and we're seeing anti-Semitism across the globe. It is the most awful actions from citizens in our own countries. In the UK, we've had Nazi iconography shown at protests. We've had "Gas the Jews" shouted in Sydney. I think there's a real bringing together of Jewish people across the world and in Israel. It's not really a time to get into what went wrong, I think, with Israeli governance right now. But absolutely, of course, there will be a time for that. And when that time comes, there will be discussions about the military personnel that were threatening to not turn up, and the mass protests for months on end that distracted Israel and perhaps distracted resources. And that there will be a time for that. I think right now there is unity. There's unity in the face of anti-Semitism that we always knew was there, and now it has been realized in the most atrocious way.
So Herb Keenan, I'm going back to that question I asked one of the panelists earlier. This whole thing hinges on if Israel and its supporters, the Western countries, can contain the fallout of this war, can contain this actual war to that limited geography between Hamas and Israel. Because if it spreads wider, if Hezbollah starts attacking from the north, if Iran starts attacking, if Syria gets involved, and who knows, if Egypt, if not in a military way, at least in a non-military way, gets involved in this becomes, again, an Arab versus Jew kind of a conflict. Is that something that Israel is taking into account? It's factoring in its calculations. How real is that prospect as things stand today?
Look, I think there's a great deal of concern about that. I mean, Israel is very carefully watching what's going in the north, both in southern Lebanon with Hezbollah, with Iran's proxies in Hezbollah, and in Syria, where they've also got proxies there as well. Israel is extremely concerned about that. I think the U.S. move, the posturing there, the moving of that strike force into the Eastern Mediterranean, I think that was a very powerful signal. I mean, Biden, not only did he send the aircraft carrier there, but he also sent it with a message, a very clear message that he gave the other night, saying to Iran or to any actors in the region who might want to take advantage of the situation, don't do it. For us in Israel, right, I think that was a very, very reassuring position. But we're still watching it very closely because that's a huge concern, obviously.
I'll give the final word to Mr. Srivastav. At some point, this is a question that India will also have to sort of take a nuanced position on. The Prime Minister, both in the tweet that he put out first and then subsequently after the conversation with Mr. Netanyahu, very, very clear, very unambiguous, unequivocal in condemning the terror and standing with the victims of terror, standing with Israel. But at the same time, today the MEA spokesperson said, as far as the Palestine question is concerned, India's position is something that is known and that is age-old. This whole clash or fight, pulls and pushes between, do you go all in and say that this is a terrorist attack, no ifs and buts, you have to condemn it, period, or will the politics force India to once again mean back its position to what it's always been, that while we condemn terrorism and everybody believes in peaceful coexistence, but we also, as far as the Palestinian question is concerned, believe we have to move towards a peaceful two-state solution. I mean, is this a fundamental sort of push and pull that you're going to see more of for India as well as this war continues, as this war drags on?
You know, this is not a binary choice. You need to attempt, you have to attempt both. The immediate thing, as I mentioned at the outset, is condemnation of the attack, which Prime Minister Modi and Government of India have done, followed by unconditional release of the hostages, civilians, women and children. But you have to, I think, and these are the next step, which is to address the long-standing issue, which the official spokesman mentioned, of a two-state solution. This is the timing, of course, is something which Israel can choose. But I think it's worth bearing in mind that there is a wider Arab constituency which cannot be ignored. And that sentiment was reflected in the Arab League statements yesterday. And that is, they would look for a solution, not an immediate thing, but at least some movement forward. And this is something which has to be addressed at appropriate stage, whichever way Israel likes it to do.
All right, we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much to all our guests for joining us. It has been a fascinating conversation.